We use the tumbler at Brooklyn College. I wouldn't call it large scale, but we feed the worms to tilapia. We have an aquaponics operation, small scale, that's not commercialized at this point. But we will have an aquaponics class at Brooklyn College that'll start in the spring of 2012, which is connected to the vermicomposting.
Well, yeah, just in general, I mean, I think what I do and what I've seen done in large scales is exactly what you said. In general, you have sections and you just put food on one section, wait a couple of days, they all move down there, and then you just grab the soil.
My worms must be slower than your worms.
It's been called.
You talked a lot in your presentation about the government investment in urban agriculture in the first period, but then when you were referencing World War I, and afterwards,
I'll repeat the question. The question's for Laura. It has to do with the government's role in supporting urban agriculture and the disinvestment that would occur at certain points in relationship to productivity.
Okay.
Mainly World War I and World War II?
Yeah, or Depression era too. Well, I would say pre-World War I, the federal government was not involved really in any of these efforts except the Bureau of Education, and that really was encouraging teachers to garden, but not through any kind of mandated or other program. In World War I, the various government agencies became involved, and basically it was a top-down strategy of providing information and organizing people, but the effort was bottom-up, or from kind of organizations and clubs within municipalities in different areas. So the USDA provided pamphlets, told you how to organize, but kind of you were responsible for doing that. In the Depression, it really started in municipalities, and municipalities were doing this. State agencies became involved, and there was a lot of seed sharing and other kinds of programs. And then the state started arguing to the federal government that that's where some of the relief money should go, is to supporting seeds and staff to make these things happen. Those programs ended with the New Deal. Because new programs came into play when they were organizing relief packages. They organized them in different ways, and they didn't see that as the most efficient use of those sources. But some states continued for a while, and municipalities definitely continued after that. And then in World War II, well, in World War I, like one thing I can say is that the USDA and the Bureau of Education kind of fought for a while on who was going to control the U.S. School Garden Army, and they finally came to an uneasy truce. In World War II, it was a lot of the same model with USDA and various other federal agencies providing education and telling you how to organize. And the Victory Gardens were part of the whole. Did you see that circle I had? The conserve, recycle. It was part of that overall campaign. So they were organizing, I forget what they're called now, but like basically block captains for these various things. And so it was one part of a larger structure in play. Most of those programs, they were borrowing staff while they were running those programs. And when the crisis ended, those staff went back to their other responsibilities. So it never became like a permanent object. And then the USDA Urban Gardening Program was a permanent program. It set up extension offices in 26 cities. That program was enabled because it was a deal between Senator Whitten from, it's a senator from New York City who was advocating for community gardens, and a rural senator from Fred Richmond and Whitten. Who said that? Okay, thank you. It was an arrangement between the interests of urban gardening and the interests of agriculture with the hope that by doing this, urban voters would sympathize with farmers, and they would set up that, and it was a line item in the USDA's budget until 1992. Is that right? I can't remember the exact, it might have been 1996, but I don't think so. I think it was 1990. It was Bush, if that helps. And it was basically taken out as a line item. Some states continued for a little while, and there are still some extension agents in urban areas, but basically the top-down program ended.
And this theme, of course, for everybody interested in proliferating and scaling up of this stuff, as we start to see policy proposals in New York City from the City Council, also for the Borough Manhattan President's Office, Scott Stringer has made proposals with respect to the city government becoming more involved with urban agriculture in terms of land use, zoning questions, utilization of public lands, resources, the City University of New York. But your book is very instructive here to see about, well, when these new partners come on, what are the dangers in those collaborations, and also the need not just for collaboration, but actually to transform those government agencies, not just to collaborate with those agencies, but those agencies are all inadequate to the task. I mean, the way they're set up now, right?
One of the things I really loved in my research was interviewing some of the extension agents that were running urban garden programs, because they came from two different backgrounds. Some came from horticulture, and they came to the city and they were going to teach people how to garden, and they realized that the people in the city actually knew more things than they did, and they became real advocates for community activism. And then the other group were community activists who learned to garden because it facilitated, it was a catalyst for various other things that they were trying to do. So those early era kind of extension agents were quite amazing. And they did a lot of really fantastic work. I'm not saying that all of them were fantastic, but all the ones I interviewed were pretty fantastic.
I was going to say, how many states are there active in this type of program?
How many states?
Yes.
How many states are actively, how many states have the cooperative extensions?
All states have cooperative extension, but whether cooperative extension is engaged in urban communities is the big question, and that's basically a state choice issue. So, for example, Rutgers, where I teach, my college is also the college where extension is, and they're heavily working right now to shift from being solely focused on rural and agriculture to urban issues and urban programs, whereas in Illinois, where I just came from, not so much. So, you know, it depends on the politics.
And in New York, it's Cornell that has extension services in Manhattan and Brooklyn, and in Long Island. The federal was cut in this last budget? Really? So it's to zero?
I know they phased out.
Yeah. Wow. So that was cut. They get to keep the hats? We saw the hat?
Mike. Actually, the Cornell Cooperative Extension used to do community gardening outreach. There are no people that do that anymore because of the cuts, and they solely focus on nutrition education in the city. So at the time when we have all this greening movement, it's an amazing change of venue, unprecedented for Cornell, but that's not why I stood up. I have a question because, you know, it was a great sort of ominous thing to see that the desires to have 5 million more farmers, but everyone knows there's been this whole reality with schools and kids being stuck in schools, test prep, and not getting outside. I mean, in a really major way, where they're not interacting with the environment. So I'm just kind of wondering what the panel's thoughts are about countering that parallel movement, where there's a tremendous amount of and I'm a parent, I see this in elementary school, middle school. They are not getting out even for recess, let alone to go into their school gardens, even though the city makes nice, and in the Food Works Christie Quinn policy that was issued this year about getting more school gardens, and Bloomberg claims he wants to, there's this counter thrust that completely contradicts that as an option for children to get out and really interact with the environment, plus connect to, obviously, food, nutrition, and science, which the U.S. is all behind in. Do you have any comments about
So the question's about, even though there's more interest in urban ag with schools and with young people, and there's more programs, there's also within the actual existing school system cuts that have prevented kids even from going outside more and more with physical education with recess. So you have this big barrier kind of put up as we're trying to move in this new program. Does anybody have any comments on?
Yeah, I guess that's one of the reasons that my approach has been always about jobs. You know, basically I just decided that I wanted to invent my own job and ask myself, what do I want to do when I grow up? And the whole idea is that it's great to learn how to grow food, but it's a lot better if you know how to make a living out of growing food. And making a living out of growing food, yeah, there is the production part, but there's a lot of other aspects that I feel in the experience that I have are lacking. You know, and that's the whole section of monetizing. You know, you have to give students the ability. I mean, it's almost like, imagine if you were a medical student and you couldn't have a place to practice, or you didn't have the necessary equipment to practice. You could study all you want. You might even be able to get your hands dirty and do some surgeries, but if you don't have a place to practice or necessary equipment to practice, then your education will go to naught. So, I mean, monetizing, having a way to monetize your product is fundamental.
Well, you bring up a really critical issue and problem with the school garden movement. When in the earlier phase of school gardening, it was at the same era with this thing called the playground was also being promoted related to school gardens, and we all know that the playground made it, but school gardens didn't. And even back then, they were writing about how a lot of the responsibility was put on the teachers, and the teachers weren't being reimbursed very well for this kind of work. They needed the women's clubs, the gardening clubs, and volunteers to help run these kinds of programs, and we're in that same exact place right now. So I was just giving a lecture earlier this week to master gardeners to encourage them to do their hours with schools because of those things, but the school garden issue is an absolutely huge one. What's really interesting is I have a 4-year-old and a 6-year-old, so I watch too much PBS, Sprouts kind of morning stuff. And when I was growing up, all of my cartoons were like the Rainbow Coalition. You know, we had people of all sorts of different ethnic and racial groups playing together, and I thought that was reality growing up, and it was all about my indoctrination into this new world. Today, my kids' cartoons are constantly going to community gardens, recycling, and gardening. And I know it's not real, but it's like this message that's coming at them, and unless we figure out ways to enable them to do this, it's a big issue. So I think the message is being hit on. We just need to figure out a better way of doing it so that the responsibility doesn't fall on teachers solely, because they already have a lot of other responsibilities that are being, expressed. You can't compete with a 5th grade test score in a community garden or the school garden. The school garden's going to lose in that kind of debate unless you have other inputs coming into play. But you're absolutely right.
Deborah, does East New York Farms have any relationship to particular schools, elementary schools or middle schools or high schools?
Well, we often have groups come out and visit the farm and learn about the things that we do, and are often kind of consulting with schools that are hoping to start up programs. And frankly, most of the programs that are being started are not through the school. They're from an organization outside of the school that's funded independently that's trying to start something in partnership with the school. So I think that's kind of one of the interesting current solutions that are happening right now, and a lot of them are under the guise of production, either setting up some sort of market stand or something like that. So I wonder if that's kind of the current era of where we're going right now. We don't directly work with schools because there's it's difficult. It's not, yes. It's not really. I think there's other things that schools have concerns with in East New York that don't involve gardening, but there are many schools in East New York that are starting programs like that, that are bringing their kids out, that are interested in learning, and a lot of the young people are interested, which is exciting. We had 100 applications for 14 spots for our program last year, and I think that's a testament to what, the way that kids need to learn but aren't getting that sort of access in the schools where they are. So,
well, and I think the point about testing is really relevant here, because if you follow the K through 12 budget crisis over the last 3 months since it got passed in New York State, the only part of the New York State public education budget, K through 12, that was not cut was the technology budget. And that's because the technology, which is basically whiteboards and clickers, and it was more oriented towards that than with the computers, was necessary for the administering of tests and the curriculum to teach students how to prepare for the tests. So you can see, so that tells you something about the future vision for what New York City Public Schools obligations are to their students. So in that sense, the gardens are versus the tests, right? I mean, you have to look at it that way. Could this program proliferate without changing the way that assessment works in schools? Or what even technology is, what counts as technology in schools?
One of the things to look at is there's a lot of states have an ag in the school, or ag in the classroom program. It's through USDA, again, extension, and a lot, like, for example, in New Jersey, Ag in the City has changed its name and it's really focusing on school gardens more than teaching about agriculture. And one of the things that they're doing is they used to give money to schools to build gardens. Now they're building the garden because it stops that one step from being an obstacle. And then the other thing is they're creating curriculum that's not about how do you fit the garden into a very busy schedule and a very busy school, but trying to help teachers figure out how the garden enables what they already do better, so that it's not becoming one more thing that gets put on the obligations of, 5 minutes do this, 5 minutes do that, 5 minutes do that, but that it enables you to do your math assignments better. And so they're really trying to fit it into the needs of the teachers, which is a really good model instead of adding an add-on to what's going on.
I'd just like to add just that the reality, at least in elementary schools, is that a typical period is 40 minutes long, minus 10 minutes, 5 minutes on either end gives you 30 minutes, because that's settling the class when the teacher comes in. So 30 minutes of prolonged, sustained science or gardening is not a go. Yeah. And there is something really radically wrong that, on one hand, Bloomberg and Klein now gone, they want our children to excel and be connected to global warming issues, compete in technology and science, and yet there is absolutely nothing in the school day unless maybe you're a charter, that's a whole other conversation, or maybe you happen to be an unusually powerful principal and you get to do what you want to do without having DOE breathing down your neck. But every day and almost every hour, down to half hours, in PS 139, 217, I live this in Flatbush, they are scripted almost down to the line. That's what the learning is like in many public schools. And it's crippling creativity and hands-on exposure. And I just think, I would hope that people keep pushing the envelope on this, because we all know what the global climate situation is pressing down on this generation, but they're all so busy texting and having their laptops and watching TV simultaneously, almost three things in a room. I see this all the time, and many families across the board. It's not, you can't lump everyone together. So it's just kind of critical. And the one other comment I just want to make is that I totally connect that teachers used to have the pressure to bring the kids out and make use of the garden, and due to test prep, they barely have time to get out in the garden, even if it was built for them, like 217 in Flatbush. What needs to happen is, this is a land stewardship issue. Public school property is one of the last bastions of undeveloped property, whether you look at rooftops or the surrounding garden area. Land stewards, or positions for them, or back to the jobs response, need to be created so that a farmer in districts can rotate between schools and serve the needs of teachers. The PAs, the parents, they go through, they cycle through, and so with them goes the knowledge. Okay. So I'm just,
the school properties as well as the curriculum.
Yeah.
Yes. We're over time. I think maybe we'll take one more or two more questions, but I think we had, yes.
Hi, I'm interested in hearing about the suburbs. I read Edible Estates and saw the small farms and gardens on people's front lawns.
question is, what about the suburbs?
Yeah, I'll just say that there's a huge amount of community gardening happening in suburbs. And it's for multiple reasons, and it's quite fascinating. A lot of suburbs right now, especially newer suburbs, they strip all the topsoil off, so you can't garden in those backyards anyway. They pretty much can hold lawn. And so, or there's other issues involved, and so people want to garden in community gardens, or they want social outlets, so they garden in community gardens, or they want to grow more high yield, and so they're doing it in sunnier community gardens. There's a whole lot of people in suburbs promoting the community garden idea. There was a really interesting article in the Los Angeles Times last year, and it was about the reaction against. Did you read that?
Having to do with the aesthetics of the gardens and the lawns?
Yeah, and people that were doing, making jellies, they were subsidizing their income by making basically their suburban lots into farms, and being hit with zoning violations and neighbors not liking that because of the aesthetic associated. So we have a long way to go in the suburbs, I would say.
But in Arizona, because there's no water to water lawns, they're just painting their front lawns green. So to maintain the zoning, because it's green. So that's the absurdity we're now faced with.
Actually, one of the ideas behind Ginger started as a way to create suburban renewal. Something like Ginger is actually perfectly suited for suburban areas, not necessarily in the sense of community gardens, but one of the things, if you remember, one of the third element, the three circles, when I talk about business development. Imagine if, for example, you got two identical suburbs, both 20 miles away from a Walmart. One of them, and they both sell houses for $250,000, 2 bedrooms, 3 baths, whatever it is. And let's say one suburb has houses for $250,000, and let's say that 4.5%, 30-year fixed, 10% down. The mortgage payment is about $1,230. Now imagine you had another identical sort of suburban subdivision with 20 miles away from a Walmart, but the developer, instead of selling their houses for $250,000, sells it for $270,000. The difference to the homeowners are about $110 a piece a month, except that now you got $2 million that you could then hire, graduate. And this is one of the things that the reason I'm here is because we're trying to start a program and even go as far as create a new profession that I like to call a micro farmer. So imagine if you could do something like what happens in the Silicon Valley, where you actually have a business plan, and you go up to some venture capital on Sand Hill Road, and you say, give me $3 million, and here's my business plan, and that happens often. And so imagine if you could have a graduate from a professional degree in microfarming that has a business plan vetted by a university, who can then go to one of these developers and say, out of those $2 million, why don't you give me $500,000 so I can set up the land, and not only give me $500,000, but instead of, when in the Silicon Valley, when you ask for money, they don't give you a mortgage. They invest in your company. So you don't have to pay $30, 30 days later, you don't make the first mortgage payment. Most of the farms in America today are financed using the wrong financial instrument. It's called a mortgage. That's used for your house, not for your farm. So imagine as a suburban renewal where you could have, $500,000 per farm. So a 22-year-old recent graduate from a micro farming professional degree could actually have everything he or she needs to start a farm. Now, how many people would not gladly pay $110 a month extra just so you can have 2 or 3 farms in your neighborhood? And it ties in completely with everything you guys do, because you can use the farm as a way to teach children about agriculture. Those children which become lucky kids when they're 14 and they're bored out of their minds, because it's great to be in the suburbs when you're 7, but when you're 14 you got nothing to do. That becomes apprenticeships. And by the time they're 18, they're ready to become micro farmers. And by the time they're 22, they already have a place where they can do their internship. And by the time they're 23, they already have venture capital to start their own farms. So that's, as I said, Ginger is perfectly suited for this kind of thing.
We have time for one more question.
It seems like there's a lot of food companies right now that are throwing money at
There are a lot of food processing companies that are throwing, processed food companies throwing money at farming right now. Do you want to name a name?
Brisket. Kraft.
Kraft. Any comment from?
I can't say anything about processed food companies specifically, but I can say that Walmart is trying to get into East New York, and they actually just funded a community-supported agriculture program in East New York, and are pressuring the community to let them in based on their radio ads, which are food access in a food desert, fresh food. And Walmart obviously has, well, obvious to me, has some really despicable labor practices and undercutting farmers who grow the food for them, and class action lawsuits against them by an entire gender, blah, blah, blah. So I think, it's, I think it depends on how you're approaching food access in a neighborhood. For some place like East New York Farms, where we're trying to create sustainable economic development and trying to grow food in a healthy way in terms of nutrients, but also, the way it impacts the community, we would never accept money from an organization or a company like that, and think that it's counterproductive in terms of community development and building access and the right to have healthy, affordable food in your community. But that's because our organization has a moral objective, and I wouldn't impose that on another organization or people who are doing kind of small business, because maybe they have different sort of objectives. I can only talk from East New York Farms perspective. But
Laura, did you want to comment on this? Or then Ari?
There was a recent big dilemma in the American Community Gardening Association, because they started a partnership with Scott's Miracle-Gro to start some community gardens in low-income urban communities, and that brought up a lot of these issues as well about where the money's coming from. It's a bit of selling your soul, and then you have to figure out if the end is worth that or not in some ways, or if you can control the message, I guess is a better way. Can you control the message away from the corporate sponsor so that you're doing the work that you meant to do? But I want to know what you were thinking, because you asked the question. So what's your opinion?
I don't have an opinion, but
you don't?
I wondered if you have historical context.
Well, yes, actually, way back this was happening. So Coca-Cola supported victory gardens.
Weapons manufacturers.
Weapon manufacturers. There's Firestone was a big one.
National Cash Register.
National Cash Register Company. And what's really fascinating is it gets really kind of twisted in the Great Depression, because some of these great corporate sponsors were basically doing it to keep their laborers in place, so they could pay them less, keep them on hold, and give them some potatoes and food so that they stay in that community. But it all looked good. I mean, and the workers were happy. So you kind of have to deal with what that meaning is, and it's part of our whole laissez-faire capitalist society.
Well, I tell you what, I'm a little bit with Deng Xiaoping on this one. I don't care what color the cat is, as long as it catches the mouse. There's nothing wrong with taking money from corporate sponsors. What's wrong is how you take that money. I mean, believe me, Monsanto wants to give me $250,000 right now. I'll take it. Because at the end of the day, my goal is that 25 years from now, we're going to look at buying food at a supermarket, like a quaint Jetsons type of thing. So if they want to give me money to accelerate that process, so much the better. I mean, the trouble is when they give you money, and in reality, what they want to do is they want to buy your silence. Believe me, nobody's going to, I mean, I don't think anybody's going to give me money when they understand that I want to put them out of business. This, you know what I mean? This is not a volunteer thing. As I said, they're my competition. And I mean, think about it. You know, somebody would have told a 19-year-old kid from Finland 25 years ago, when he started writing Linux, that one day his operating system will be the most used operating system in the world, but by order of magnitude. You know, you can have, my watch is running Linux. The data center in North Carolina that Google uses is running Linux. And so, my project is a startup. It's a startup based on community. And I'll tell you one of the beautiful...
I'm saying, you're giving a Linux analogy, but who funded the Linux startups?
Actually, nobody. Nobody funded it. But what happened? But what I'm telling you is that if somebody would have gone to this guy, he would have said, sure. I mean, at the end of the day, right? It's hard to begin with, and as long as you're not willing to sacrifice the principles. And I'll tell you what the beauty about, I think, my approach is that maximizing profit. It's almost like a straitjacket. It's almost like a form of mental illness. When you think, hey, you want to give me money, but don't put conditions. Otherwise, I'll go find somebody else. Because at the end of the day, any corporate sponsor who is giving you money is either trying to make themselves look good or silence you. And so, if they want to make themselves look good, what do I care? But they're not going to silence me. They're not going to say, well, don't do it this way. And so I think it's how you do it, So.
Okay, thank you, and thanks to the Community Institute for Sustainable Cities and to our panelists for covering all this stuff. And thanks for your great questions.